there. So I thought I'd take the opportunity to speak a little bit more about the new Paradigm Centre for Calming Trauma and Embracing Purposeful Health. And in this short video, I'm going to expand a little bit on some of the things that I've already written on this website page. So first of all, it's really nice to be able to welcome you here to this page, and I'm really glad if you're reading it in the hope that you're interested in the ideas that are being mooted here. So first of all, as I mentioned in the page, I've held for a very long time the notion of bringing together a space that somehow works with mental and emotional health in a slightly different way, or a very different way to the mainstream services that we can sometimes find ourselves in. And over the years, this has led me to realise that we're not just talking about mental health in the way that we might currently think of mental illness, as it's called, or mental health diagnoses or mental health conditions. I've come to realise that it's much more of a whole person thing. We can no longer get away with simply siphoning off certain parts of our life in order to analyse it or look at it in some detailed way separate from everything else in our lives. And so when I'm working with people who have emotional challenges, and I prefer to say emotional challenges or emotional distress because that's what we're really talking about here, and moving away from that notion of mental ill health, which has all sorts of connotations which aren't always very positive, I've found. So the notion here is that we really have to look at the whole person, and that means across all 5 domains of life. And if you've looked elsewhere at other bits of work that I'm involved in and the theoretical approach that I've written, that means we're looking at our physical or physiological health, we're looking at our emotional health, our psychological health or mental domain, our social health and our spiritual health. And really we can't look at any sort of condition of any kind without taking into consideration all of those 5 things. So when I was first thinking about these ideas kind of about a decade ago, I was very heavily involved in what is called the recovery model or the recovery movement. And one of the challenges as I started to realise around the recovery movement was that we were still very much tied up and identified with a label, albeit recovery from some kind of label that we were given. But nonetheless, we were still very wedded to that notion that there was some kind of illness, some kind of condition that we need to recover from. And ever since that time, I have very much moved towards the notion of looking at health in general. And there may be certain times when we feel very emotionally challenged, of course, but we're always looking at taking a whole person approach to that across those 5 domains, as I said. And one of the challenges is when we get very limited and focused in on one specific area, we can become quite obsessive about a name or a label or a diagnosis, whatever you want to call it. And then it limits us from finding other things in our world that may be contributing to these difficulties that we are facing. So I will never look only at somebody's emotional or mental health and only work on that in isolation. So I mentioned on the page that there were 2 projects that had taken my interest a long time ago. One of these was called the Soteria Paradigm, and the other one was called Kingsley Hall. Now, the Soteria paradigm began in the States, and the notion was that there were residential places set up that were kind of an alternative to the psychiatric hospital. But the notion was that they took a recovery model approach rather than a medical approach, which meant that people who were suffering from what they call the psychoses, and some of the labels that go together with psychosis, were given the opportunity to heal and recover in an environment that either didn't use any antipsychotic medications at all, or very, very small amounts of antipsychotic medication for very, very short periods of time while someone was in acute distress. And the notion here was that none of the staff were medical staff. Everyone was a peer. So usually these places were staffed by people who maybe had lived experience of recovering from some of these challenges and conditions. Now, those projects started in the 1970s and spread out into locations all around the world. And I believe there is still a Soteria paradigm place that's still operating in Sweden. And the other place that I mentioned was Kingsley Hall. Now, Kingsley Hall, the particular Kingsley Hall project that I was interested in, was set up by a psychiatrist actually called R.D. Laing. And it started in 1965. And R.D. Laing was well known for being in the group of what was then called the anti-psychiatrists. So he was a psychiatrist who had realised that a lot of the things that we called mental illness were actually certain ways in which people were expressing themselves and their challenges in a specific way, particularly with the thing that we call psychosis. His notion was that it was a bit like a waking dream, and he also recognised that there were certain cultures in the world where this kind of state was actually revered. And so Kingsley Hall was set up as a place in London where people could go and try and find meaning in their experiences. And to all intents and purposes, both of these projects were actually very, very successful in certain ways. The thing that kind of paid to them in the end was more what the local community felt about these places, and these days we might say the NIMBYs, or the not in my backyards. So there was a lot of challenge from people in the local community who were a bit against the idea of having those types of people in our neighbourhood. And really these are the things that started to put pay to those kinds of projects, along with the fact that they often lacked funding, because of course what was preferred was the medical approach, and where certain institutions were not prepared to give money to something that did not kind of adhere to the medical model as such. So where does that leave us now then? Well, as I said, I believe, or I kind of know, that we really need to move on from the recovery model. The recovery model served its purpose for a time and was designed to move us away from that medical model, and you can have a look on the Purposeful Health page, which gives a table showing the differences between the medical, the recovery and the purposeful models, or the Purposeful Health model. And the notion here is that in Purposeful Health, we're not actually looking at what's wrong with us. What we're looking at is moving towards or sustaining a state of health, taking responsibility over our own health and well-being and directing our own care so that we know where to go and find the education that we need, how to apply some of the steps, where to go if we do need to partner with somebody with our health for some reason or another, and then ensuring that we are continuously taking that responsibility and working on our health and our overall health across all 5 domains. So the notion behind the New Paradigm Centre was, and the clues in the name, and I explained on the page that a paradigm is a set of ideas or concepts or thoughts that come together to kind of form a way of doing things. So as you saw in the table on the Purposeful Health page, the medical model has its way of doing things that we can identify. We can say these things and these things and these things constitute the medical model. And the same with the recovery model. And as I say, we want to move a step further on with Purposeful Health, where we're not just focusing on being in a state of recovery, because the trouble with being in a state of recovery is that we are always in a state of becoming. Yeah, we are not acknowledging health when it is with us, and that's not to say that we don't at times experience challenges with our health, but that we kind of have to view it in a different way. We have to view not what's wrong with us, but the things that we can be doing in our everyday lives to ensure that we remain healthy. And that also means knowing the steps that we need to take to recover health, so we can recover health, or to get back into alignment with a healthy state. And that's my preference. Rather than being in recovery, we are ensuring that we are doing the things that keep ourselves in alignment with a state of health. Okay? So, whilst I have been, as many others have, I'm sure, sat here for 3 months during lockdown, and if you're watching this video in 2021 or later, then you will know that this dates us to the middle of 2020. So during this period of time, it's given me an opportunity to actually start putting pen to paper around what I would actually like to provide for people. And as you will have seen from my other writings, it has become, in research, we are now finding that trauma, stress, and social situations and circumstances are the things that cause us emotional distress on any level. And that includes some of those things that people find very scary to hear, like those labels such as schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, which you will see in some of my mental and emotional health courses, how we can deconstruct those things and make sense of them in a way which is in alignment with the current scientific research. So we now know that the actual diagnostic criteria that label distinct mental health conditions has no reliable, valid or scientific evidence to uphold them. Now, as I've said, this doesn't mean that we don't have those experiences, but we have to look at them in a different way. We have to learn how to make sense of those experiences, a bit like R.D. Laing proposed in the Kingsley Hall experiment. So my notion for a centre for trauma is that we are going to step into a new paradigm. That means we are no longer going to view this as a medical health condition. And we're also going to move on from the recovery model. We're not always going to be in a state of recovering, okay? we're going to learn how to take meaning from our experiences and then how to correct them so that we can be in alignment with health for us. And of course, you know, you will read studies and cases or autobiographies of people who may see things and hear things that others don't, what the medical terminology might call hallucinations, but that there are lots of people out there who live with seeing things, who live with hearing things, and they don't actually view them as problematic. Now, the challenge is that with some of these experiences, some people do experience a lot of challenge. They can be quite nasty, and they can be quite upsetting and disturbing at times, but that's not the case with everybody. And to a certain extent, we can still glean a lot of information by the ways in which these kinds of experiences present themselves. And sometimes we can perceive these experiences as negative or disturbing because there is no current cultural context in our Western society that can hold those kinds of experiences as something which expresses meaning for us. And in those cases, it can kind of warp the experience for us. So the notion here is that we're going to set up the centre in 3 phases. And I'll do another video outlining what those 3 phases are going to be, and there is a page in the drop down menu from here which outlines briefly some of those phases. Now, it is currently fairly limited at the moment, in the middle of 2020, the extent to which we can provide obviously in-person face-to-face services. So inevitably some of this is going to start off in a virtual space, and I will be working on setting that up imminently. And we can do a lot in the initial stages by simply educating ourselves. Having the tools and the knowledge and the techniques available to us through having learned about them can be enough for some people to overcome some of the challenges that they experience. But first of all, you know, having some of that knowledge is really, really important. And then we want to provide a community space, both online and face-to-face and in person, where people can come together and share their experiences of growth and development. And we're always going to be moving forwards in development, rather than staying stuck in all of the things that are going wrong. We're going to start looking forwards to all of the things that we can do to help ourselves and to help each other and to ultimately feel better. Now, I'm going to leave this video here right now, and I will break up some of the steps and some of the things into small videos so that you can get a sense of what we mean by things like trauma, what we mean by things like stress, what is purposeful health, what are the things that we can do in this kind of a context together. And it's terribly, terribly exciting. There is so much that we can do to get back into alignment with a state of health, as well as to sustain our health, both individually for ourselves in our own lives and together in community with each other. And I'm just so, so excited to have finally started to realise this aspiration for you and for all of us. Thank you.